of, well, 13 to 16.
And a cloudy day for southern Scotland, with a few light showers in the west. Winds will be light through the morning, but freshen up for the afternoon. Highs of 14 there.
Northern Ireland seeing sunny spells to start with, but it will become cloudier through the morning. Some light showers and fresher winds for the afternoon. Highs of 15 Celsius.
Rain and stronger winds will sink southwards across the north of the UK through the rest of the day. And that's your weather.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
To each and every one of you.
for helping our great nation.
Find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England, Scotland,
Wales and Northern Ireland. On TV.
on radio and online.
We're proud to be
The People's Channel, Britain's
News Channel.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flock at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me! And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know. The latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Good morning. You're watching and listening to GB News. Coming up this morning on the political correction, we'll be talking about the not-so-many budget following the Chancellor's statement on Friday. We will also be looking ahead to the Labour conference, which begins today in Liverpool. That plus much more after your latest headlines with Ray.
Good morning. It's 10 a.m. Here's the latest from the GB Newsroom. Well, as we've been hearing, the Labour Party conference gets underway in Liverpool. Sir Keir Starmer has announced plans to end the UK's dependence on fossil fuels by 2030. The leader of the opposition will use the annual gathering to set out his energy plan and appeal to voters who are, as he says, sick and tired of soaring energy costs. Sir Keir claims that generating electricity through renewable and nuclear power would save each household around £475 a year. Shadow Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds told us it's a realistic plan.
Fantastic natural resources in terms of what we can do on renewable energy, on energy efficiency, on new nuclear. And yes, it is realistic to say we can take fossil fuels out of the energy mix by 2030, no longer be exposed to these global prices, and indeed be able to export energy that we make here in the UK to our neighbours, have money coming into the country from that. That to us is a better long-term plan for growth and prosperity for the country.
Voting is underway in Italy in an election that could see the return of the country's most right-wing government since World War II and its first female Prime Minister. An alliance led by Giorgia Meloni called Brothers of Italy appeared on course for victory when the last opinion polls were published. However, support for the left-leaning Five Star movement has picked up in recent days. Voting continues until 10 p.m. UK time. A British fighter, freed from Russian-backed forces, has admitted he didn't think he would survive. Aidan Aslin told The Sun on Sunday he was beaten and stabbed during interrogation. He was sentenced to death alongside fellow Briton Sean Pinner, but released after 5 months last Wednesday. The Prime Minister is expected to relax immigration rules as part of plans to boost business growth. Employers have been calling for more migrant workers to be given UK visas due to labour shortages. It comes as the number of migrants crossing the English Channel this year passed 32,000. The Defence Secretary plans to spend at least £52 billion on Britain's military in response to Russian aggression. In his first interview since Liz Truss became Prime Minister, Ben Wallace said it will be used to grow Britain's armed forces. He told the Sunday Telegraph that the 3% spending increase comes after decades defending against cuts. COVID testing in Scotland's healthcare system will change from next week. Starting on Wednesday, health and social care workers will no longer need a weekly COVID test. The decision also applies to people admitted to hospital, but care home restrictions remain in place. A clean-up operation is underway after Tropical Storm Fiona devastated Canada's Atlantic coastline. Hundreds of thousands of people are without power and a state of emergency has been declared, though there's been no reports of injuries or deaths. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has deployed the military to help with the country's recovery.
There have been evacuation orders issued. Hundreds of thousands of people are without power. There are reports of roads washed out and homes destroyed. We've all seen the images. This is a very powerful and dangerous storm.
And a flotilla lit up parts of the River Thames in London last night as a tribute to the late Queen Elizabeth. As part of an installation called Reflections, 150 illuminated boats travelled from Albert Bridge to Tower Bridge at around 7 o'clock. The Queen's Row barge Gloriana, rowed by Ben Fogle, was the centrepiece. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's get back to the political correction.
Good morning, you're watching and listening to GB News, and this is The Political Correction. I'm Marlene Foster, and today I'm joined in the studio by Paul Embry and by the political editor of The Express Online, David Maddox. We're here for the next 2 hours to correct politics and to put you, the people, back in charge. And this is not about journalists talking to journalists, it's about you telling us what you think. So coming up this hour, we'll be taking a closer look at the mini-budget from Friday as Kwasi Kwarteng, our Chancellor, outlined a series of tax cuts and economic measures that he says will boost growth. And we'll be discussing the Labour Party conference, which commences today in Liverpool. It follows comments from Sir Keir Starmer that the Tories make the rich richer and do nothing for working people. And as ever, here on The Political Correction, we want to hear from you. If you want to get involved in the conversation, all you have to do is email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is The Political Correction. So the big news on Friday actually was that mini-budget, and Kwasi Kwarteng has said that tax cuts aimed at boosting economic growth are fair, despite being accused of gambling with the economy. The Chancellor scrapped the top rate of income tax as part of the biggest package of tax cuts in 50 years. And some Tory MPs have said it was wrong to cut taxes for the wealthy during the cost of living crisis. I'm going to start with Paul here. I think I know the answer to this question, but is the Chancellor gambling with the economy, Paul?
I was going to give you 3 guesses to decide what my view was. I mean, I don't know about a gamble. I think it probably is a gamble. But more importantly, I think it was a mini-budget for the rich, for bankers, for fat cats, for the city money men. It was not a budget for hard-pressed Britain. It was not a budget for hard-working, ordinary Britons out there in the provinces and the towns of our country who are experiencing this cost of living crisis, who are experiencing a crash in living standards, a fall in real wages, and who I think were looking for some real tangible support from the government, instead of which we've been given effectively a Robin Hood budget, but in reverse, with the poor giving to the rich. And I think it's Thatcherism Mark II. We are borrowing, and this is the thing, and this is the politics of it as much as the economics of it. We're borrowing billions of pounds to give to tax cuts to the wealthiest in our society at a time when the poorest in our society are having it extremely tough.
Well,
for me, indefensible.
Well, Paul, it's not just the wealthy that are getting tax cuts, and I want to bring David Maddox in here because I saw you nodding vigorously in the negative direction when Paul was speaking there. David, what's your view on the mini-budget?
Look, tax cuts create wealth. They put money back into people's pockets. They allow people to spend their money in the economy. Yeah, and it wasn't just for 45p rate, but when there was an enormous amount for help for energy bills. In fact, their biggest borrowing was actually to help people with their energy bills. There was a basic rate of income tax is at its lowest rate now in history, I think, actually. And it's, this is this was actually not just for the rich. Actually, it helped right across the board. And, there were important things there, like getting rid of the national insurance rise, which have really hurt the lower income people and the middle income people much more than the upper income people. And, bringing down or cancelling the corporation tax rise, which allows companies to invest here, to come over here to create jobs. So, it's an easy hit to say, an easy headline to say, oh, this was a budget for the rich. It's absolute nonsense.
What's interesting, I think, Paul, this morning, Keir Starmer has said that he would bring back the top rate of tax when he gets into government, he says, but he would keep the income tax reduction, in other words, the 20 to 19p. So he's even picking and choosing as to what he likes from this mini-budget.
I mean, I think there's an argument to say there should be targeted tax cuts for the poorest in our society. I think, it's arguable to say that at a time of a cost of living crisis, give the poorest people more of their money. But there is no question that the tax cuts at the top end, the scrapping of the 45p rate, the reduction of the corporation tax, for example, are going to put thousands, if not millions of pounds into the pockets of people who are already the most wealthiest in society. They are the people who unquestionably will benefit from this. And, this is, let's be blunt, this is a return to trickle-down economics. This is a return to a philosophy that says, if we can make the rich richer, if we can give them even more wealth than they've already got, then eventually some of that wealth in the form of crumbs will reach the table of the people at the lowest end of society. It was a philosophy that the Tories applied in the 1980s, and I think we are still suffering in many respects the legacy of that in terms of or we did for many years at least, in terms of underfunded public services, in terms of widening of the gap between rich and poor, increases in wealth and income inequality, and so on. And this for me, Arlene, was the epitome of this. For any government at this moment to say, we're going to scrap the cap on bankers' bonuses at a time when we're telling the public sector, for example, that there isn't enough in the pot to be able to give them decent pay increases. I mean, as you know, my industry is the fire service in terms of my primary job. And firefighters have been offered 2% this year. These were the people who kept working during the pandemic, during the recent heat wave. They were on the front line and so on. And they've been told, we can't afford more than 2%. At the same time, the government is saying, but we can afford to borrow billions and to give tax cuts to the richest. That, to me, shows the priorities of the government.
Well, to push back a little bit on the bankers' bonuses, as I understand, they were finding a way around that in any event and paying bankers more, actually, instead of incentivising them to do more in terms of productivity. And that's what they're saying now. Let us look at productivity instead of just paying people more to keep them here. And secondly, corporation tax. I mean, I feel quite strongly about this. When I look at my nearest neighbour in the Republic of Ireland, they have corporation tax at 12.5%. And as you know, that is their primary tool to get inward investment into the Republic of Ireland. And they guard that very jealously. They will not allow Europe, and they have always pushed back when Europe has tried to get them to raise the level of corporation tax. They keep it at 12.5%. So it works for them, Paul.
Well, it shouldn't be a race to the bottom, in my view. And look, I'm not suggesting punitive rates of taxation. I'm not suggesting that we put tax, whether it's corporation tax or whether it's personal income tax, at such a ridiculously high level that people don't invest or that they do go abroad. But at the same time, there has to be a balance. We have to say, look, at the moment, real wages are falling, living standards are falling, the poorest in our society are having it really tough. We've got underfunded public services. Is it the right time during a cost of living crisis to say that we're going to draft a budget that essentially puts more money in the pocket of the richest and not the poorest in society. And you know, just imagine, Arlene, I make this point, just imagine if the Labour Party under Corbyn, for example, had said we're going to borrow billions in, you know, it's going to be unfunded, we're not entirely sure how we're going to pay it back. Jeremy Corbyn argued that we should borrow when interest rates were low in order to invest, which I think is perfectly legitimate, actually. But imagine that the Labour Party had come forward with some sort of mini budget, which had had the effect in terms of the markets that it's had in terms of the pound lowering against the dollar quite seriously. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a massive...
Well, neither do I, because of exports, obviously.
Well, exactly, for all sorts of reasons. But you can imagine what the media reaction would have been.
Well, look, you've mentioned Labour. I said we would be covering the Labour conference up in Liverpool this morning, so I just want to take a brief pause in this conversation, which we're going to come back to, and to cross over to GB News political correspondent Tom Harwood, who's reporting live from the conference. Tom, what's the mood like up in Liverpool this morning?
Well, conference proceedings are set to get underway in just a few minutes' time. We'll hear the leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, speak at the very opening of conference at around 11:15 this morning. But really, this is a Labour Party today that is trying to project a more united sense of itself than we saw last year when the conference gathered in Brighton. If we cast our minds back then, there were factional fights on the floor of the Labour Party. There were members voting against the AUKUS deal, for example. Lots of battles over whether it was nuclear issues or constitutional issues within the Labour Party, how easy it is to deselect members of Parliament and the rest of it. Much less of that going on this year, less constitutional wrangling on the floor of the conference, and a party that is further ahead in the polls than it has been in quite some time. Since the defenestration of Boris Johnson, the Labour Party has had a relatively steady 10-point lead in the polls. And speaking to people in and around the Labour Party this morning, they do have a sense of optimism and are trying to project a vision of Labour that is ready for government. This has been the challenge of the party for the last 12 years. Has it looked like it is ready to take on government? Has it looked like it is competent and credible? That is the challenge it has this conference, not to try and make big news splashes in the way that a party that perhaps is behind in the polls might, but to solidify its position and try to appear competent. We'll hear little policy announcements. We heard, of course, the Labour Party today announced that it wants to bring forward the country's renewable electricity target, 100% renewables, not in 2035 as the government wants, but in 2030 instead. Not the biggest policy announcement in the world, but clearly just again that sense that it wants to present itself as a competent party. We'll hear a little bit more about that today, not just from Sir Keir Starmer's short opening speech, but also from Angela Rayner giving her deputy leader's speech a little bit later this morning. And one little extra tidbit. I've been snooping around this morning a little bit at the Labour Party conference, popped my head into the conference hall and saw the Labour Party officials testing a video from the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Labour Party leader was attacked as being quite a boring, perfunctory figure who managed to win their general election earlier this year. Could the Labour Party be trying to model itself on Albanese's Labour victory in Australia? Quite possibly. It will be interesting to hear what the words of that video are, perhaps a little bit later today.
Well, Tom, thank you very much for joining us from Liverpool. I see you're rocking your red tie today, Tom. We're looking forward to your blue tie next Sunday, but thanks very much for joining us from Liverpool. And we're going to stay with Labour because the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has said that the plan that we were talking about earlier on, the mini-budget, is an admission of 12 years of economic failure. David, I want to come to you on that, because is that a fair statement from Rachel Reeves? Because what would Labour have done differently?
I don't think it is a fair statement, because 12 years ago we were coming off the financial crisis, the worst one since the Wall Street crash in the 20s. And they had a whole different set of problems to deal with. I think, though, it's a fair statement for the last 3 years. And what we've seen is Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss essentially tear up the Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak book with the economy. And, and say that they were wrong, that they, I mean, to go back to Paul's points earlier, you know, we have the highest taxation level since the Second World War, and it was creating stagnation, it was choking the economy. And, you know, a lot of these things, people may think that Kwasi Kwarteng went too far. In fact, he was suggesting in my former paper, the Sunday Express this morning, that he's going to go even further very soon. And actually, if you want growth, if you want companies to relocate here, if you want wealthy people to live here and pay their tax here, then you actually have to incentivise it, and that's what he understands.
I thought it was interesting, actually, because one of the newspapers was talking about the fact that Scotland, of course, have their own income tax laws, so it's whether they decide they're going to cut income tax as well. And actually, they were saying some people from Scotland might relocate to England, actually, because of those.
That was in the Sunday Telegraph, and they talk about people relocating from New York as well. But what's interesting is that even before this, Scotland had higher income tax rates than England and was getting less of a take in tax as a result. So, you know, there is this, you know, the whole Laffer curve argument, but actually, I mean, in fact, you can use the last cut in the top rate, which went from 50p to 45p. When George Osborne did that, they ended up taking more money from the wealthy, not less.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, because David has written an article today, Paul, about the fact that Liz Truss has trashed Boris Johnson's legacy in 24 hours. And as some papers, I think it's the Express, are saying today, there's more to come. What do you make of that?
I think it's signals an end to one nation Toryism, actually. I mean, there is that element within the Tory party who I think do understand, look, we can't necessarily go back to a Singapore-on-Thames model where it's kind of low tax, low regulation, let the market absolutely dominate, privatise everything. I don't think that worked in the 80s by and large, and I don't think it's the right philosophy for our time now. So it certainly does. I mean, if you look at the 2019 manifesto, for example, Arlene, I think this philosophy certainly signals a departure from that manifesto. I mean, that manifesto, and in fact the 2017 manifesto for the Tories, was much more focused on levelling up. It concentrated more on working class communities and talked about the need for a protective state to help regenerate those communities, to intervene, to spend money. Talked about, you know, industrial strategies and that kind of thing. So this seems to me to be a significant shift away from that. And I don't buy the argument that, you know, all you have to do is you need to cut corporation tax and personal income tax, and all of these big companies will come flooding in, and as a result of that, they'll make huge profits, and all of that will trickle down to the man or woman on the street. I think, actually, if you look at the Scandinavian economies, which take a much more different view and understand the need for reasonable levels of taxation so that you can fund public services, the welfare state, and so on, arguably those economies have performed better, certainly in terms of the perspective of ordinary working people and the average citizen, than any country that adopts this kind of hardline neoliberal approach.
But what do you say to David when he says that we got more of a tax take, actually, by cutting the top rate of tax? Well, I mean, what's your answer to that? Because if with more of a tax take, that's obviously more money for public service.
Well, I mean, there was the old thing called the Laffer curve, wasn't there? Where you know, the argument was you can get to a particular point where you maximise tax revenues. I mean, I've never actually bought into the argument, and I think it's been largely debunked. But of course, look, it's common sense to say if you put taxation at a totally punitive level, then you're not going to assist the economy, you're not going to assist in investment, you're going to drive businesses to the wall and so on. And it's simply about having a balance to say, look, we need to get real wages rising, we need to get investment in our public services, we need a decent welfare state, we're in a cost of living crisis, we need to make sure that people at the bottom end of the scale are able to afford the necessities, the daily necessities of life, and a budget that focuses on reducing taxation to a level where the richest are making thousands and thousands each year now as a result of it. I don't think is going to assist the economy.
Yeah, I just want to bring David in
I just want to come back on this Singapore-on-Thames idea. We've never actually really tried that in this country. We've never had that sort of low levels of taxation. We've never tried to be competitive on the world stage like that. Ireland, as you were saying, has tried it a bit with their corporation tax rates, and you know, some would like our rates to go down that low as well, because it would bring more businesses in and so forth. But actually, the criticism of Singapore model, Singapore has the best education system in the world. Every year it comes out #1 in the world. So, the idea that low taxation equals bad services is not necessarily true.
I mean, look, you'll remember the 1980s, and we know what happened when Thatcher kind of imposed that hardline monetarist ideology in the 1980s. All of the wealth flooded to the city of London. Industrial areas in Britain were completely decimated, and we saw mass unemployment, certainly in the early days of Thatcher. We saw the increase in the gap between rich and poor, wealth between rich and poor. We saw increasing wealth and income inequality. We saw, the miners' strike, for example, when hundreds of thousands of men were thrown on the scrap heap. And communities like that are still suffering the legacy of that today, where, it's all about financial services, it's all about privatisation, it's all about the money men in the city, it's all about the markets, and there is a price to pay for that. And I think we paid a really
and yet the Thatcherite legacy has never been dropped, not even by the Labour governments. The basic economics of Thatcherism remained. I remember after she died, Lord Ashdown, Paddy Ashdown, gave a speech in the debate giving tributes to her, and he'd said he'd spent his entire political time in Westminster opposing her economic policy. But then when he was sent over to Eastern Europe to help rebuild after the Yugoslav war, actually had to use that economic policy to help rebuild, and understood that it worked, because sometimes you have to retract to rebuild, and we had failing industries which needed to go.
Anyway, coming up after the break, we're going to be looking more into the Labour Party conference. I'm sure we'll come back to this conversation as well, which is taking place in Liverpool. And as ever here on The Political Correction, we want to hear from you. So if you want to get involved in the conversation and have your email read out in the show, then email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
To each and every one of you.
for helping our great nation
find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
across England, Scotland,
Wales and Northern Ireland. On TV,
on radio and online.
We're proud to be
The People's Channel, Britain's
news channel.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flock at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. Over a drink, we have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Welcome back to The Political Correction. Well, in the 2019 general election, several constituencies in the Northwest voted Conservative for the first time in decades. Workington and Cumbria, Bolton North East and Greater Manchester, and Blackpool South and Lancashire, to name but a few. Paul, what do Labour need to do to win back those red wall seats?
I think the party needs to change its priorities, which it's slowly doing. I think for too long it's been focused on, what you might call fringe issues rather than speaking the language of what really matters to working class communities, you know, family, home, work, community, defence of the nation state and so on. I think the Labour Party for too long has been immersed in this divisive creed of identity politics. I've said many times on this show, Arlene, as you know, I think it has increasingly over the years become a party much more middle class for graduates, for people living in our fashionable cities and university towns and so on. And I've also made the point that I think there's a danger that the Labour Party thinks that all it needs to do is to move on from the days of Jeremy Corbyn and renounce Jeremy Corbyn, and the working class vote, the red wall vote will come flooding back. Actually, Labour's problems did not begin with Jeremy Corbyn. The data shows that the loss of the working class vote, as far as Labour is concerned, actually began to happen around the turn of this century, when millions of former Labour voters started to abstain, or they went to parties like UKIP and so on. So there's an enormous amount to be done. I think in some respects the mini budget is helpful for Labour because it now creates a clear dividing line.
Yeah.
So Labour can essentially say, right, back to the 80s with Thatcher, or a more kind of progressive interventionist type of economics and politics with us. But until the Labour Party itself reforms itself from within, and that process is taking place gradually, and until it starts speaking again the language of working class people, then there's absolutely no guarantee it's going to win the next election. There's a huge, huge way to go yet.
Yeah. I'm smiling to myself because progressive interventionism, that's a new one from you, Paul. I'm not actually sure the two sit very well together in my view. But David, I mean, what are you expecting from the Labour conference in Liverpool this week?
I'm going to be interested to see how the Corbynistas react to it all, and whether there's going to be a kick up from it, because there's a lot of unhappiness out there. You only have to look on social media and see what they're saying. I'll be interested to see what happens when they sing the national anthem at the start of the conference, how many people actually sing. I mean, I think Keir Starmer's absolutely right to do that, by the way.
Yes.
I mean, one of the issues for the Labour Party, unfair in some cases, but not unfair on the round, is that it was perceived as very unpatriotic, anti-patriotic, actually, in a lot of cases, and they need to kind of deal with that from the start. But I agree with Paul, actually. I think they've got a long way to go. If their best hope is that the Conservatives mess it up, then they're probably in trouble. I think they've got to get rid of this kind of sneering attitude.
Yeah.
They've got to reconnect with working people, and they've got to rebuild trust, which is actually going to take a lot longer. And it's interesting, I mean, you talk about the clear dividing line. You've got to remember the first Red Wall voters actually came in the 1980s, and it was from our part of the world. They were in Essex and Kent. They were working class people there who turned to Thatcherism. So, you know, essentially what we've seen is a spread of that into the Midlands and North. So, you know, there's a long way to go for Labour.
Yeah. And I mean, conferences, Paul, are for the membership. They get together, they listen to what their leadership is saying. But the leader's speech will, of course, speak outside of the hall, and he'll want to give out some messages, won't he?
Yeah, the leader, if he's got any sense, will always try and pitch his or her speech beyond the hall, because he knows the whole media are watching, the press pack is there, it's going to be reported heavily the next day. They have to get their messaging absolutely right. I don't think it was unhelpful for Starmer. I think it was last year during his conference speech when he got heckled by certain various
and he handled it very well.
He handled it very well. He was probably expecting it. He probably knew how he was going to react, and for him it was probably a good thing because he was able to say, look, I'm taking these people on, these people who made the Labour Party unelectable. I'm now taking these people on. So I think by and large, Arlene, conferences don't have a huge impact in the public psyche particularly. Most people don't take much of an interest in them. But the leader's speech, I think, can be definitive sometimes. I mean, I think back to 1985, Kinnock's famous speech in Bournemouth, where he took on the militant tendency in a big way, and there was uproar in the hall. But what that did is it showed to the wider public and to the media that Kinnock himself was taking on the infiltrators, the people who had come into the party like parasites, essentially, and were trying to take it in an extreme direction. So in terms of agenda setting and in terms of direction of travel and messaging, that's going to be important. important. So his speech needs to be well pitched, and if he was seeking my advice, I would simply say you need to do everything you can to focus on the red wall, because if you don't win back the red wall, you are not going to win an election. So you've got to win their hearts and minds, you've got to speak their language, everything needs to be pitched towards those voters.
And remind me, Paul, in terms of the Clause 4 changes, were they announced at conference? Is that what they were first talked about?
Clause 4, the old Clause 4, which was essentially, nationalise everything in the country. Tony Blair got rid of that, and that was in 1995, the year after he took over as leader. And he did, you're right, he called a special conference of the Labour Party.
It was a special conference.
It was a special conference of the Labour Party, and they introduced a new Clause 4, which was much more fluffy and much more public friendly, which was drafted by himself and John Prescott. But again, I didn't necessarily particularly agree with that. I felt it was unnecessary at the time, but clearly he did it because he felt it was important to show the public, look, we're moving on from old Labour. This is now a new party and you can trust us.
But I suppose, David, and just wrapping this section up, have the Conservative Party, the party of government, really set the agenda by what they did on Friday with their mini budget? It's going to be talked about right throughout this Labour conference, you would have thought.
Yes, absolutely. I think they have, and it's not just the mini budget. It's not just the record tax cuts, most in 50 years. But it's getting back to that article you referred to of mine, it is a trashing of a Boris legacy, and actually a much more kind of social democratic form of conservatism that's really dominated the party since Cameron. And, it's things like fracking, going for fracking and prioritising energy security. There's a clear move away from climate change politics as well, which a lot of Conservatives have been crying out for. So, this is quite a radical government already. It's only been in for a few weeks. And I think they really have set the agenda. And, whether it works or misses
is another story, and I'm sure this programme will be covering for many weeks. Well, our North West of England reporter Sophie Reaper has been catching up with the people of Lee to find out what Labour would have to do to win back their seat there.
Today, the annual Labour Party conference will begin in Liverpool.
We're in the middle of a national emergency. People are really scared.
A well-established Labour heartland, Merseyside may be a safe bet for Keir Starmer and his MPs, but what about the rest of the North West? Since 1922, the people here in the constituency of Lee have always voted Labour. Even before that, they voted for the Liberal Party rather than for the Conservatives. However, in 2019, that all changed. With a swing of 12%, the Conservative Party were able to take this constituency right in the Labour heartlands for the very first time. So, what can Labour do to rebuild their red wall here in the north?
I think if they go back to the working person and Labour try and pull through on dealing with the working person and the average person that's in Lee, delivering on what they said they're going to do. And then Excel's twist.
As the owner of a hot yoga studio, Leah's energy bills are forecast to double come the winter. This week, the government announced they were capping the cost of gas and electricity for the next 6 months. But for small businesses, Leah says this isn't enough.
6 months flies by. It gets us over winter, yes, it's a help. But it's getting to the point where you do question whether you're going to survive. It's getting to the point where you think, is it worth it? Keep trying to fight through it.
With over half of small businesses in the UK predicting they will shrink or even fold within the next 12 months, Leah is not alone.
We've had 3 years of a Tory government in Lee. There's been no change. I've not seen any change whatsoever. Sick and tired of people keep going on about it's levelling up. We desperately need something doing, you know what I mean? Not just for ourselves, all the small traders down country.
So, what would Labour need to do to win back the votes of Lee's constituents?
For me, with any politician, I'd rather they be honest and set goals that are realistic for people.
They need to invest in the town centre. If you go to the high street, so many shops are boarded up or vacant.
I think a lot of people want Labour back in to do for the working class people, and to make changes.
Like many up and down the UK, the people of Lee want a government who can deliver during these hard times. Now, if Labour want to rebuild their red wall here in the north, they'll have to prove themselves brick by brick. Sophie Reaper, GB News.
Well, let's now return to the week in politics and the ongoing cost of living crisis. And this week, the Bank of England warned that the UK may already be in a recession. Well, let's now welcome Conservative MP John Redwood. John, obviously there's been quite a marked reaction to what happened on Friday. Very interesting to see the Sunday Telegraph saying today that the critics of the budget are actually missing the point. Obviously, you welcome what happened on Friday. Tell us why.
Well, I welcome the fact that the government recognised that it's now fighting recession more than inflation. Inflation will come down next year. The Bank of England has changed its policy from being far too loose, a policy which was fueling the inflation, to a tough policy now which will bring those prices down. And we're seeing some relief at last on world markets. The price of oil is down by about a third from its peak. Price of wheat is down by about 30% from its peak. So there's some relief coming. We need to then see that pass through to customers, which will probably be next year rather than this. So we need to fight recession, and that requires putting more money back into the bank accounts and pockets and purses of consumers in the country. We can't afford the energy bills, so there's been a very big package to deal with that. And the taxes were too high, so cancelling the national insurance surcharge and taking some money off the income tax bills is very welcome to fight that recession.
John, there's been a reaction to the fact that the pound has dropped very low against the dollar. I mean, is that something that people should be concerned about, or is it actually good for our exporters?
Well, it's happening to all the major currencies of the world against the dollar. The yen has fallen even more this year against the dollar than the pound has. The euro has fallen a lot against the dollar as well. We don't want it to get out of control, but all the time America has decided on having ultra tough money policy now to curb their very nasty inflation. They've got a Federal Reserve Board central bank saying they now want a recession in order to flush inflation out of the system. And all the time American interest rates are higher than ours, there is a natural temptation for the money managers of the world to put a lot of money into dollars and take it out of yen, euro, sterling, and that's what's been happening. You don't want it to go too far because then we have to pay too much for our imports.
Well, that's it. And finally, John, I mean, it was quite a comprehensive mini budget, if you know what I mean, on Friday. But is there anything else that you would like to see the government doing? Because we hear today that perhaps there's going to be more tax cuts. Is there anything else that you would like to see happening?
Well, plenty, and I hope we can have a proper discussion about this morning. I think this is just the starting point, getting rid of the national insurance surcharge, taking a bit off income tax, and tackling the big issue of high energy just gets you back into the opportunity of having a bit of growth rather than a slump. But we now need a whole series of measures, deregulations, particular tax incentives, public-private sector partnerships, encouragement of private investment, because we need to rebuild energy self-sufficiency, we need to increase our generating capacity, we need to get more of our own oil and gas out of the ground at a time of international shortage, we need to grow more of our own food, we need to set about restoring some of the badly damaged fortunes of our heavy energy using industries. We need to be encouraging more ships to be built in British shipyards rather than abroad from our MOD programs. We need to have more government procurement working with private sector enterprise as they did over vaccines, so that more better paid jobs can be created in Britain by public spending in a competitive market. There are so many things we need to do. I'm desperate for them to get on with it, and I'm delighted that we've now got a government with a sense of urgency and purpose that recognises you need private enterprise, lower taxes, more promotion of growth to get these things happening, because that's what good Conservative policies are all about, energising the private sector, getting the better paid jobs, making sure that when people succeed, when they work hard, when they take risks, they can get some rewards and the state doesn't steal all of it.
Well, thank you, Sir John. I'm very glad I asked that question, actually, for you to come out with that comprehensive answer.
About this.
Yeah.
We've got all these moaning minutes who think that it's wrong to let people keep more of the money they earned and the money they generate from risk-taking, good investments that create jobs. And we've got all these people saying we need an independent forecast. Well, I've got news for them. There are dozens of independent forecasts out there. They can read them to their heart's content. Some of them are right, some of them are wrong.
Well, thank you. John, we're going to have to leave it there because we're going to a break, but thank you so much for joining us this morning. So coming up after the break, we'll be talking about the worrying developments in the war in Ukraine, and we're expecting Sir Keir Starmer to speak at the Labour conference very shortly. We'll bring you that live here on GB News as it happens.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
to each and every one of you
for helping our great nation
find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England, Scotland,
Wales and Northern Ireland. On TV,
on radio and online. We're proud to be the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flop at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Welcome back to the Political Correction. We're hoping to go across to Liverpool soon to hear from the Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, but lots of you have been getting in touch with us and we were going to read out some GB views as we wait for Sir Keir to come along. Paul, what have you got?
Yeah, quite a few coming in, Arlene. We've got one from Carla who says, I am deeply concerned for my son's future. His wages cannot sustain a normal living life. Increase the personal allowance to at least £15,000 to give our youngsters a life.
Yeah, I'm always impressed by our viewers come forward. They'll tell us what the problem is, but they'll then suggest a solution as well. So I think that's really good. David, have you any that you want to share with us?
Well, I think we've got a good one here from Nicholas. I think he kind of gets to the point, actually. Why invest in UK if you can get cheaper, less taxed elsewhere? Republic of Ireland learned that lesson harshly when EU subsidies ended faster than they expected.
Yeah. It is actually when you look at the Republic of Ireland and how they have grown their economy, but they still very much rely on the European Union as well. Dennis says, I'm not convinced the budget does solve things, but cuts and more cuts wasn't working either. Fair play for trying something different. And I think there is a sense that amongst the electorate that people are glad that we're at least trying to do something different. Now we're going to go over to Liverpool, where Sir Keir Starmer is about to open the Labour conference.
Thank you, conference. Conference. The late Queen Elizabeth II was this great country's greatest monarch. She created a special personal relationship with all of us. A relationship based on service and devotion to our country. Even now, after the mourning period has passed, it still feels impossible to imagine a Britain without her. Hardly any of us have ever known anything else. For us, the late Queen has always been simply the Queen, the only Queen. Above all else, our Queen. And I'm proud to lead our party's tribute to her today, because our Queen's devotion to Britain was underpinned by one crucial understanding. She knew that the country she came to symbolise is bigger than any one individual or institution. Between the history we cherish and the present that we own, she was the thread. A reminder that our generational battle against the evil of fascism and the emergence of a new Britain out of the rubble of the Second World War don't only belong to the past, but are the inheritance of each and every one of us. An example that taught us that whatever challenges we face, the value of service endures. And a reminder that the creativity, the hard work, the enterprise that defines this nation is as abundant now as it ever was. That the prospect of a better future still burns brightly. That's why the people came in their droves to pay their respects. So, conference, as we enter a new era, let's commit to honouring the late Queen's memory. Let's turn up our collar and face the storm. Keep alive the spirit of public service she embodied, and let it drive us towards a better future. For 70 years, Queen Elizabeth II stood as head of our country, but in spirit, she stood amongst us. So please join me in paying tribute to the late Queen.
Conference, for those that can stand, please stand for a 1-minute silence to pay tribute to Her late Majesty the Queen.
Sir Keir Starmer, paying tribute to Her Majesty the Queen, calling her our Queen. She was known as the Queen in all of the world, but very clearly saying that the Labour Party very much values what the Queen embodied for the nation, although he did keep referring to Britain rather than the United Kingdom, but that's an issue, obviously, that I would notice more than anything else. So, Paul, tell us what you felt about his opening statement.
Well, I think he's obviously trying to tap into the mood of the nation, and we know the mood of the nation at the moment. We are, very broadly speaking, a pro-monarchy nation, and often, frankly, the support for the monarchy, as Clement Attlee once said, tends to be found at its highest levels on the meanest streets. It tends to be working class people who love the monarchy more than other groups within society, the very people who Sir Keir Starmer knows the Labour Party needs to win back. So I think he's probably doing it from a point of principle, but also with an eye on electoral factors and the fact that, as David said earlier, Labour has got a patriotism problem. So some of this and what he's saying now, I think, is designed to address that.
Send him victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save the King.
So we just wanted to allow the national anthem to be played there, sung by a beautiful Welsh voice, and others actually joining in as well. And that's the first time we've had the national anthem played at a Labour conference, and surely that's quite significant in and of itself, David.
I think it is, actually, and actually I thought Keir Starmer was very impressive there. I've not been his greatest fan of, since he became leader, but I think he was very impressive there. I think Paul's right. I think he's putting the party there back with the majority of the British people and actually tapping into a much wider sentiment. And it's not just monarchism, if you like. It's actually a deeper sense of patriotism.
Yes.
And, it's rebuild after the disaster of the Corbyn years. And it's interesting, but the whole there clearly took well to it. There wasn't any protests or shouting out.
Yeah.
So it might have been in previous years.
It's quite clever, I thought, having a very strong voice lead the national anthem, because then that allows the national anthem to boom out around the room. Did you think that was quite clever, Paul?
Yeah, I think it's shrewd politics
Yeah,
around, to be honest. I
absolutely.
mean, it's quite unusual. I've been to many Labour Party conferences, so it's quite an unusual thing. But as David said, people do often associate support for the royal family with a general kind of affinity with patriotism anyway. Now, of course, you don't have to be a royalist to be patriotic. I mean, you can look at France, for example, we're very much proud of its republicanism, but also a very patriotic country, the same as the United States. So, it's not for me a given that you have to be a supporter of the institution of monarchy to have a love for your country. But as far as we are, as far as we're concerned in Britain, there often is that association. I think Starmer recognises that, so probably a shrewd move on his part.
And I think we discussed this at the time, Paul, do you remember about Emily Thornberry and her sneering, back to David's point, at White Van Man and hanging out the Union, or I think it was the flag of St George, actually.
Yeah,
and that's the sort of thing, is it not, that Labour needs to move away from?
It's absolutely the thing. I mean, that was very famously, as you said, she was the Shadow Attorney General at the time, and it was the Rochester and Stroud by-election, I think it was in 2014. And clearly, I mean, I know Emily a little bit, and I like her very much, but nonetheless, she is very much an Islingtonian.
Yes.
She represents Islington South. She's got a kind of lawyer's background, and she...
Not all lawyers are bad, I just...
Well, present company accepted, naturally. But she saw this white van and the flag of St George hanging down from the window, and clearly thought it was so notable that it needed to be tweeted with some comment. And that really, I think, goes to the heart of the problem with the Labour Party. It is stuffed full of people who do look at patriotism as something odd. They can't get their heads around it. They think it must be born from some sort of xenophobia or national superiority. So that needs to be addressed, certainly.
Yeah. So this idea of inculcating pride in your country is something that Keir Starmer has obviously identified. David, what do you make of it?
Yes, I think he has, actually, and I think, again, it comes from a mistake of the last few years of allowing somebody like Jeremy Corbyn to lead the party where the opposite sentiment was dominant. But actually, it's unfair. Actually, I mean, Paul was right. It's unfair to just pin it on Corbyn, because there's a much wider problem within the Labour Party. It's become very much a kind of student, middle-class, London-centric party, which is why it lost those red wall seats, which is why it now has to rebuild trust with these kind of communities, but it lost.
And the Brexit vote as well. Let's not forget. Labour's position on Brexit was suicidal. I was at the Labour conference in 2018 in the hall, where speaker after speaker was getting up, supporting a motion calling for a second referendum, and I was looking at them thinking, you've effectively written your suicide note for the next election. You've handed a P45 to so many Labour MPs in the North and the Midlands. So I was not surprised in 2019 when large numbers of those
It was worse than that, though, because they were equating support for Brexit with racism as well. They were going much deeper down than that. They were essentially attacking people's patriotism. And Starmer, I'm afraid, actually plays a big role in that.
And two-thirds of Labour constituencies voted Leave. Let's not forget that. Two-thirds of Labour.
I didn't know that. That's quite a striking statistic.
Two-thirds of Labour constituencies voted Leave. So when the Labour Party said to those people, actually, we think you got it wrong and we're going to make you do it again, naturally those people kind of thought, well, you're completely devaluing my vote. You clearly don't think I'm intelligent enough to vote for what I want. So get stuff, frankly. If you're not going to speak for me, then we'll throw a lot in with Boris Johnson, and we all know what happened in 2019.
And just very briefly, because we're coming near the top of the hour, Paul, but real strike next weekend for the Tory conference. No real strike this weekend. Why is that the case?
No, because, look, let's be blunt. I mean, if you're in a battle, if you're in a war of attrition, then you are going to pick tactics that enable you to advance your case and puts the other side under pressure. And I think the RMC has been quite astute by bringing the rail strike literally to the door of the Conservative Party. I'm pleased to see, actually, that the new Transport Secretary, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, has met with Mick Lynch of the RMC and Mick Whelan of ASLEF. That's something that Grant Shapps didn't do when he was Transport Secretary. The truth is, these disputes have to be resolved through negotiation. So that's a good thing. So hopefully it won't come to that. But if it does, the Tories have only got themselves to blame.
It just proves that it's political. It was always a political move. It's always an attempt to bring down a Conservative government.
No, it's not. People working on the railways, it's not just about train drivers, it's about cleaners.
On 50k,
well, it's not about those. It's about cleaners, it's about office workers, clerical staff, train managers and so on. And some of these people are not on very high wages at all. And they're asking for a below inflation pay increase at a time, when there's a cost of living crisis and people are struggling. And imagine these people looking at this mini budget and thinking, you've just handed a massive tax cut to the richest in our society, and you're telling us that we're not allowed more than a few percent in terms of all.
But Paul, I think the point that we're making is it was always said that this was not political. It was about people's jobs, about getting them more pay. But it is political. Let's be honest. At least let's be honest about that.
Not in the sense that they want to bring the government down. I mean, it's political. That this particular tactic of the Conservative Party conference. Anyway,
we're going to have to go because that's it for the first hour here on GB News, and we'll say bye to David. Thanks for joining us this hour, David. But keep those views coming in, and we'll see you shortly.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
to each and every one of you
for helping our great nation
find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England, Scotland, Wales
and Northern Ireland. On TV,
on radio and online. We're proud to be the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flock at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. Over a drink, we have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Good morning and welcome back to the Political Correction. Coming up this hour, we'll be talking about the government formally lifting a ban on fracking for shale gas. We'll also be discussing the PayPal dispute after they shut down the account of the Free Speech Union. And Labour Deputy Leader Angela Rayner is due to speak at the party conference in less than half an hour. So we'll bring that to you live as it happens. That plus plenty more after the latest news with Ray.
Good morning. Coming up to 1 minute past 11, here's the latest from the GB Newsroom. As the Labour Party conference gets underway in Liverpool, Sir Keir Starmer has announced plans to end the UK's dependence on fossil fuels by 2030. The leader of the opposition will use the annual gathering to set out his energy plan and appeal to voters who are, as he says, sick and tired of soaring energy costs. Sir Keir claims generating electricity through renewable and nuclear power would save each household around £475 a year. Shadow Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds told us he thinks Labour's energy plan is realistic.
Fantastic natural resources in terms of what we can do on renewable energy, on energy efficiency, on new nuclear. And yes, it is realistic to say we can take fossil fuels out of the energy mix by 2030, no longer be exposed to these global prices, and indeed be able to export energy that we make here in the UK to our neighbours, have money coming into the country from that. That to us is a better long-term plan for growth and prosperity for the country.
Well, we've just heard from Sir Keir Starmer. The Deputy Labour leader is set to outline a new code of practice for the public sector in around half an hour's time. Angela Rayner will use her speech at the party conference to lay out plans for a Fair Work standard. It aims to guarantee job security, training and union access. Ms Rayner will also pledge her party's support for the self-employed, vowing to ensure that they're paid on time. Voting is underway in Italy in an election that could see the return of the country's most right-wing government since World War II and its first female prime minister. An alliance led by Giorgia Meloni, called Brothers of Italy, appeared on course for victory when the last opinion polls were published. However, support for the left-leaning Five Star movement has picked up in recent days. Voting continues until 10 p.m. UK time. A British fighter freed from Russian-backed forces has admitted he didn't think he would survive the ordeal. Aidan Aslin told The Sun on Sunday he was beaten and stabbed during interrogation. He was sentenced to death alongside fellow Briton Sean Pinner, but released after 5 months last Wednesday. The Prime Minister is expected to relax immigration rules as part of plans to boost business growth. Employers have been calling for more migrant workers to be given UK visas due to labour shortages. It comes as the number of migrants crossing the English Channel this year passed 32,000. The Defence Secretary plans to spend at least £52 billion on Britain's military in response to Russia's aggression. In his first interview since Liz Truss became PM, Ben Wallace said it will be used to grow Britain's armed forces. He told the Sunday Telegraph that the 3% spending increase comes after decades defending against cuts. COVID testing in Scotland's healthcare system will change from next week. Starting Wednesday, health and social care workers will no longer need a weekly COVID test. The decision also applies to people admitted to hospital, but care home restrictions remain in place. A clean-up operation is underway after Tropical Storm Fiona devastated Canada's Atlantic coastline. Hundreds of thousands of people are without power and a state of emergency has been declared, though there's been no reports of injuries or deaths. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has deployed the military to help with the country's recovery.
There have been evacuation orders issued. Hundreds of thousands of people are without power. There are reports of roads washed out and homes destroyed. We've all seen the images. This is a very powerful and dangerous storm.
And a flotilla lit up part of the River Thames in London last night as a tribute to the late Queen Elizabeth. As part of an installation called Reflections, 150 illuminated boats travelled from Albert Bridge to Tower Bridge. The Queen's row barge Gloriana, rowed by Ben Fogle, was the centrepiece. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's get back to the political correction.
Good morning. You're watching and listening to GB News. This is the Political Correction, and we're here for the next hour to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. So coming up this hour, we'll be discussing the implications of the government formally lifting a ban on fracking for shale gas in England. And we'll be looking into the PayPal row after the company received criticism for shutting down the account of the Free Speech Union. We also, of course, want to continue to hear from you. Send us your views on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is the Political Correction. So US payments company PayPal has shut down the account of the Free Speech Union, as well as the account of its founder, Toby Young, over alleged COVID vaccine misinformation. Young said he had not been told why the accounts had been closed and accused the company of ramping up big tech's war on free speech. Well, we're delighted to be joined in the studio by the former Deputy Research Director at the Free Speech Union, Emma Webb. Emma, this is a huge attack on free speech, and it's quite ironic that it's the Free Speech Union that they've targeted, isn't it?
I think that we can't emphasise enough to people how serious this is, because, so firstly, it's not just Toby Young's personal account that was shut down last Thursday, but that was followed by the Free Speech Union, by the Daily Skeptic, which is an online publication that he runs. That was also followed by another campaigning group, a parental campaigning group called Us for Them, which is parents who wanted to have schools open during lockdown. There have been another of other independent journalists, legal groups of lawyers who were campaigning against, for example, mandatory vaccination and things like that, that have had their PayPal accounts closed down for entirely partisan reasons, that PayPal, it seems, essentially just disagree with the views that these people and these groups are expressing. And I think, like I say, we can't emphasise enough how serious this is, because we keep hearing about the cashless society and how we are veering into a world where basically, for the sake of convenience, everything will be online, which gives companies like PayPal and other online platforms huge amounts of control. And what we're seeing now is their clear willingness to wield that financial control, to manipulate public debate, to try and control what people are allowed to express, and to use financial punishment as a way to censor them. And I think that it's, this is not just about the individuals who I've already mentioned in the campaigning groups, but the potential for this to really impact on people's ability to express, which is their right, their views freely. I think we really need to reconsider the cashless society and the amount of power that we're handing over to these platforms.
I mean, who are PayPal? Because we talk about PayPal, but who actually are the people that take the decisions to close down accounts like this? Because that's very worrying, isn't it, Paul? I mean, this is really heavy stuff we're talking about here.
I think it's Orwellian, actually. A free speech organisation being told you're not allowed to
have free speech.
To have free speech. And the truth is, when it comes to the issue of lockdown, there were a whole range of views over the merits or otherwise of lockdown, and there were prominent people on either side of the debate, well-qualified people who put their case quite convincingly, I think, in some cases, in terms of the arguments that Toby and people like him advanced. And look, you don't have to agree with them, by the way. You can challenge them, you can say they're wrong. But the idea that there should be this arbitrary decision which says, we don't like what you're saying, and therefore we're going to impinge on your right to say it, when these big multinational online companies have huge power, can effectively cripple an organisation, can effectively stop an organisation operating effectively at all. And I just think I'd be interested in Emma's view on this. I mean, I think I don't instinctively call for legislation over these issues, but if we're going to see businesses, institutions, organisations crippled in that way, there probably has to be some legislation saying you can't just do that. You can't just have the power to stop a company functioning or an organisation functioning because it expresses a view which is, in many respects, mainstream, but because you don't happen to like it.
Yeah, so it's the faceless bureaucrats just closing it down without any recourse for the likes of Toby Young or Free Speech Union, Emma.
Yeah, I mean, it's another example of big tech being fundamentally unaccountable, because there was no recourse. Toby couldn't get anything from them. He tried to contact them and wasn't successful in doing that. And that's the case with big tech across the board. And I think that you're right, that this is a point that Fraser Nelson from The Spectator had made this week in The Telegraph. Very good point, that we have the government pushing for this legislation, the online safety bill, and that legislation would give more power, yet more power to these companies to silence people's opinions, possibly on the grounds of misinformation, which we know there has to be an arbiter of what misinformation is.
And it's back to the legal but harmful definition.
And I think that is very concerning. So rather than steaming ahead with this online safety bill, I think the government should be considering, like you say, different type of legislation that protects individuals and protects their financial circumstances from financial punishment being waged by these companies that are becoming increasingly powerful globally, because they do have the monopoly. If a company had a monopoly in another kind of way, that would be of a concern to the government on anti-competition, laws.
Did you think, Emma, it speaks to actually a wider problem in our society, which is a lack of diversity of thought and opinion? I mean, we always preach diversity about all sorts of things, don't we? But when it comes to diversity of thought and opinion and expression, that seems to me to be being reduced. And it's almost now as if on many subjects there's an orthodoxy. There's an orthodox position. Certain people at the top decide what that orthodox position is, and if you don't subscribe to it or if you dare challenge it, then we're going to clamp down on you and to stop it from happening. I mean, I find that sinister, and I think it does exist, that kind of rigid orthodoxy now.
Yeah, I think so. Like you were saying, it's Free Speech Union. It's not even that the Free Speech Union doesn't put forward a particular view. It's Voltaire style, just defends the right of everybody else to express their views. So that, in its own way, is especially sinister. But I do think that there is a problem with the way that we're actually, in many ways, being forced to frame this by talking about things like diversity of thought, diversity of opinion, because we're using the language of quotas, of categories. And I think we have to emphasise the fact that the right to free expression is a fundamental right. It's not something that exists beside all of these other things and that can be fit into some kind of quota, that we have a certain number of people who can express this view and that view and so on. So I think that's one of the concerns, that if you were to create legislation to protect individuals, to protect diversity of thought, you would need to do it in such a way that emphasises the primacy of free speech rather than it being a kind of category among others.
I see. And I mean, the truth is as well, I think, that society, history tells us that society only progresses when orthodoxies are challenged. I mean, some people throughout history who challenged orthodoxies were themselves, they were put in prison sometimes, they were killed in some cases, and later were proved to be vindicated. Their ideas were proven to be right. And a society that says, actually, you don't challenge an orthodoxy is one, I think, that goes backwards. And the truth is, if people come forward with opinions that don't have validity and that are wrong, then trash them, take them on in debate, show why they're wrong, and the rest of us are intelligent enough to look at the merits of the argument.
Sunlight's the best disinfectant.
Exactly.
So this is back to the COVID debate, of course, as well. And you will remember that Jacinda Ardern at one point said, don't listen to anybody else. I am the person that's going to give you what is the truth. Everybody else is telling basically porky pies. I mean, that to me was an incredible thing to say. As you say, not allowing other people to challenge her and her saying, well, sorry, that's wrong and here's why it's wrong, but just saying, don't listen to anybody else. I am the sole person to give you the authority.
And in some cases, people who did challenge the orthodoxy of lockdown and so on, I mean, they were completely marginalised. Some people, I wouldn't necessarily say lost their careers, but had a big
they were
impact on
trashed.
them personally. Their reputation was trashed, as you say. And I think that culture of fear was created, which meant that, mainstream media, where you would expect dissenting voices. The whole point of having a media and comment sections in newspapers is that you expect dissenting voices, but these people were very, very few and far between. And I think that was largely as a result of the climate, the really sinister climate was created.
And talking of things that have caused controversy, the UK government has formally lifted a ban on fracking for shale gas in England, citing Russia's invasion of Ukraine as justification for exploring all avenues to achieve energy security. Business Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg said, in light of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine and the weaponisation of energy, strengthening our energy security is an absolute priority, adding that it's right that we've lifted the pause to realise any potential sources of domestic gas. And I thought it was interesting, Paul, today that the one policy intervention that has been announced at Labour today is around energy, and they're saying they want to be totally reliant on renewables and nuclear by 2030. Do you think that's a bat back on the fracking?
Well, I think renewables are notoriously unreliable.
Correct.
Very, very happy with renewables in principle, but they have to be reliable. You have to get to a point where you know that the lights are not going to go out.
Well, storage is the important part of that, of course, as well.
Of course. Yeah. And, we've discussed it on this programme before, Arlene. I think what's happened over recent years with our energy policy in this country is a national scandal.
Yeah.
The fact that we don't have energy independence, and that's largely attributable to some of the decisions that we've made, where we've had this kind of rush to net zero, and we've phased out coal, etc. And we're reliant now on a very volatile market. I think we need a serious post-mortem in terms of how we got into this position in the first place. And in fracking, look, I think if it can, I think it's right that people raise environmental concerns where there are genuine concerns, and those need to be addressed. But I think if they can be addressed and if it can be shown that it is a safe and viable way of moving forward, then I think absolutely we should do it. It seems slightly hypocritical to me that we import shale gas from the US and are quite happy to do that. So we say, oh, if there are earthquakes, we're quite happy for them to take place in the United States, but we don't want them here. And of course, you know, into the bargain, I was listening to the GMB union earlier this week that represents a number of people in the energy sector, and they said the number of jobs that could be created around it could be very high as well. So that needs to be factored in, I think.
Emma, what's your reaction to the announcement from Jacob Rees-Mogg?
Well, I used to be one of the, as a sort of arch NIMBY, I used to be one of the people who was really worried about fracking, and I've actually been convinced that it's a good thing for us to do. So I'm very happy that this has been announced. I think the concern is that part of this is to do with energy security, and you've already mentioned, you know, renewables are notoriously unreliable. We don't have the ability to store the energy that we create, and the production of nuclear energy is going to be quite a way down the track. And the same is also true to do with fracking as well. That's going to take some time. But fundamentally, this is about energy security. And if we had gone ahead with this in 2011, we would now be in a much more secure situation right now. And I think there's a lot of hypocrisy in the debate around energy, as particularly from the environmentalist perspective. A lot of things that, when you look into them, turn out to be a real false economy, such as importing fracked gas from abroad. That doesn't seem to make any sense to me. So if we were to frack in the UK, we could tax that here. It could be put straight into the grid. It would make our market more stable and secure. It would also mean that we would be able to export some of that to countries like Germany, which would wean them off of Russian gas so that Russia wouldn't be getting that tax money. So overall, this would create far more stability for us. And also, given, although this isn't something that we would be able to do in time for this winter or possibly even next winter, but given what we're facing in terms of human suffering as a result of our absolutely botched energy policy over the last decade or so, I think having the ability to have a stable source of energy for the next 50 or 100 years here in the UK and have that within our control seems like a very sensible option to try and reduce price and therefore to reduce suffering.
It's taken one crisis, hasn't it? It's taken one international crisis to highlight the madness of our energy policy over recent years.
And not just us. When you look at some of the other European countries like Germany, my goodness, that is incredible.
I think as well that the evidence that you mentioned, you know, weighing up the evidence as to the environmental damage that this could cause. I think a lot of that evidence has been completely almost covered over and clouded out by the political considerations of people like me who don't, you know, NIMBYs who don't want things to be in their areas. But I think that actually when you look into it, things like seismic considerations, the requirements that have been put onto fracking are so much more than on, say, construction, which also cause seismic occurrences. So.
Well, coming up after the break, we're going to be again at the Labour Party conference live in Liverpool, where Deputy Leader Angela Rayner is expected to speak very shortly.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
To each and every one of you.
For helping our great nation
Find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
across England, Scotland, Wales,
And Northern Ireland. On TV.
on radio, and online. We're proud to be the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flock at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farrow.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Welcome back to the show. Now, we'll be going shortly back to the Labour conference in Liverpool, where Deputy Leader Angela Rayner is due to speak very soon. Emma, how critical is this conference to Labour's fortune? How important is it to get the messaging right to those of us outside of the hall?
Well, I firstly wonder how many people from outside of the hall will actually be watching it. I don't know how many potential Labour members or Labour voters will be that interested in what's going on within the Labour conference. But I think it is important because this is, the one point during the year when the whole party comes together, and there are only a few opportunities between now and the next general election for this to happen. Just two, I think it is. Is that correct? Or possibly
2024 is the December 2024 is the latest the election.
Yeah, and
so
and so I think that this is pretty fundamental, just in terms of them being able to sort of solidify their own identity as a party going forward, because now we're in this period of extreme flux, not only with Her Majesty the Queen passing away, but also with the new Prime Minister and all of these new announcements that go along with that, and but changes potentially to the budget, energy policy, all of these things. So I think the Labour Party needs to use this as an opportunity to shore up its own sense of identity, because it needs to be able to, if it wants to win at the next general election, if it wants to win those marginal seats, it needs to, for its own long-term benefit, win those seats, not because the opposition to the Labour Party, not because the Conservative Party have failed to hold on to those seats, but because they deserve to have those seats. And I think this is important in communicating to the British public, or at least solidifying the message that they will communicate to the British public further down the line, how, why and in what way they are a party waiting to be in a leadership position, that they are a government in waiting, because I think that's something that the people, remain to be convinced of.
And I see their conference strapline, Paul, is a fairer, greener future. So they're very much nailing their colours to the mast, as it were, in relation to the energy policy that they're pursuing.
They are, and I think, as I touched on earlier, Arlene, I think, Truss's very ideological approach, in my view, going back to Thatcherism, now creates an opportunity for the Labour Party. There's a clear dividing line now where Labour can say, actually, we haven't all converged on this centre ground. The Tories have gone to the right. We're now going to present a radical economic programme which will give you a new economic model which will shift the balance of wealth and power in this country in favour of ordinary working people. I think there's a big audience for that, by the way. I think one of the positives of the Corbyn era, for all its errors, was that people understood that Britain was inherently unfair economically, and he had at least the desire to tackle that. And I think that there's a receptive audience in the country for that kind of economic programme. But Labour can't rely on that alone. I mean, it had a radical economic programme in 2017 and 2019, didn't win an election. You have to also understand the instincts and the impulses of ordinary Britain, small-town Britain, provincial Britain, working-class Britain. Labour has been terrible at that. So if it can marry a radical economic programme with what I call the cultural politics of belonging and get off some of the fringe stuff, the identity politics, which ordinary Britons have got no time for, then it might stand a chance. But I emphasise the word might because there's still a mountain to climb, I think.
And of course, we're seeing the Labour conference at the moment. There seem to be delegates coming up and making various points to the floor before Angela Rayner comes up to the podium.
I appreciate the work that the Conference Arrangements Committee do.
Oh, it's the Conference Arrangements Committee. It's very fundamental, that.
I was going to say, this is probably the tedious business which begins Labour Party conferences and most trade union conferences that I've been to, which is the Conference Arrangement Committee, where it gives its report, and then delegates, if they wish to challenge that, if they think something's wrong, they can raise points of order and they can come to the rostrum and challenge, and sometimes it will go to a vote. So I'm hoping there won't be too many delegates challenging, but sometimes these things can go on for quite some time, I know from experience. And the Conference Arrangements Committee is quite a contentious body because, you know, people think it's in one camp or the other. They think it's Starmer's, you know, poodle, or, you know, in the days of Corbyn, it was Corbyn's poodle. So it can often be a source of conflict. People think it's political in the way that it's arranged conference, in the way that it's timed.
Doesn't allow people to speak.
Doesn't allow people to speak, in the way it's timed particular debates. Some things it's put on the agenda, some things it's left off of the agenda. And people will get angry about it, and therefore they'll get to the rostrum and say, no, this was wrong what you've done, and this needs to be put back on the agenda.
Brilliant. I love it. Labour Party politics at its best.
Oh, you don't know what you're missing. You don't know what you're missing.
Well, we're not missing it. We're seeing it without the sound. But Emma, in terms of, I mentioned fair, greener future, and Paul talked about the fairer element of that. But the greener element of that, of course, is net zero. So they seem to be very much going down that line of, again, separating themselves out from the Conservative Party in terms of what they want to do on the green future.
I think they may be, in that respect, nailing their colours to the wrong mast, because I think that a lot of the, like we were saying earlier, the sort of hypocrisies and problems around net zero, the green agenda, how feasible these things are. You know, only on the way here, I was talking to the cab driver who was driving an electric vehicle about how it would be possible for the whole of London, for example, to be electrified and use electric vehicles. We'd have to rip up all of the roads and lay down cables so people could charge their cars and things like that. I think as we get closer to that 2030 deadline that has been arbitrarily set, mostly at the behest of Greta Thunberg, that we will start to realise just how infeasible and utopian a lot of these aspirations are, and what those impacts will have on people's lives. Because a lot of the, you know, one of the reasons for the higher energy cost is actually to do with green levies. It's because we are subsidising renewable energy that is highly unreliable. And so there are all of these things that, in many cases, same with fracking, we've seen the same thing in the Netherlands with the seizing of farmers' lands, that in the pursuit of net zero, that when people start to see that net zero is being privileged over their lives, their livelihoods, their well-being, their quality of life, I think they will start to realise that these are unfeasible aspirations, and the Labour Party will probably find themselves in real trouble unless they find a way to make their green ambitions realistic.
And what the party, I think, needs to remember as well is thousands of union members, for example, in the GMB and Unite, work in the traditional energy sector.
Yes.
And if you have this kind of cliff-edge transition, and that's why it's certainly...
It's not a transition, it was just basically closing off the oil and gas.
Exactly, and it's why the GMB, quite rightly in my view, over recent years have raised real concerns where they've said, look, you know, of course we want to move to a greener energy policy if it's viable, but you've got to make sure that you don't just throw thousands of workers who are employed currently in the energy sector on the dole. You've got to make sure that you make jobs available for those people, and you've got to make sure basically the thing works going forward, that you can't just rely on renewables if it's not viable and if it's not actually working. You've got to have energy self-sufficiency and independence, and you know, you've got to safeguard people's jobs and livelihoods so far as you can. You know, we don't want a 1980s situation where the Tories decided actually the mines are no longer viable, we're going to throw hundreds of thousands of guys on the scrap heap, because we saw the legacy of that. Just set aside the economic argument, which I don't think, you know, held much water anyway, but the social legacy of that in terms of what happened to those pit communities and, you know, the breakdown in marriages and, you know, the drugs abuse and alcohol abuse. Some of those pit communities are still suffering the legacy of that 30 or so years later. So we need to have an eye on that when we think about the, you know, effectively closing down the traditional energy sector.
I suspect they're going to realise that the fairer and the greener in that slogan are not compatible with each other, because as we've seen demonstrated already, the green agenda is not compatible with workers' rights.
Yeah, so it's back to that issue we were talking about earlier about fracking creating jobs for people. I mean, if you're going to have a Green New Deal, which is what we hear about a lot, about creating new green jobs, then let's talk about that. Let's see what the strategy is for moving people to greener jobs. And is fracking a part of that? Clearly, the Labour Party doesn't think so, Paul.
No, and there's a debate has taken place over many years in the Labour movement specifically about fracking. We've had that debate at my own trade union conference, the Fire Brigades Union. And it's a difficult debate because obviously large sections of the Labour movement are very much in favour of moving to a greener energy policy, and they don't see fracking as having any part of that. But as I said, some of the unions involved in the Labour Party have got thousands of members, A, in the traditional energy sector who they're worried about, and B, they're looking at fracking potentially as a replacement for some of the jobs that might be lost in those other industries, and, you know, more generally the creation of thousands of jobs anyway. So these debates are taking place, I dare say, on the fringe at conference, and maybe in the conference hall this week some of those debates will be taking place there too.
And we're still waiting on Angela Rayner coming to the stage. We're hoping, I know the way conferences work, they never run to time. Let's be honest about that. But I think we've had the last of, what was it, the conference facility?
Conference Arrangements Committee. Come on,
Conference Arrangements Committee. I think we've had the last of those people on the stage.
God willing.
Yes, exactly, DV. So we're now waiting for the Deputy Leader to come to the stage and let us hear what she has to say. But I was saying, Emma, to David Maddox earlier on, actually, the Tories have really set the agenda for this conference by what happened on Friday with the not-so-many budget, haven't they?
Yeah, and I think, again, the Labour Party is having to be reactive to what's going on within the Conservative Party, and the proof of the pudding will be in the eating as to whether they can actually come up with sensible and intelligent responses to that carve out the Labour Party's identity as a party, without it just simply being a kind of knee-jerk, we will do the opposite of whatever the Conservative Party will do.
And I would caution the party against going too heavy on the whole energy issue. I mean, of course, it's big, and we know energy bills have gone through the roof, and the whole thing is very volatile. And there's a legitimate debate to be had about our lack of energy independence and how we found ourselves in this position as an advanced Western industrial country. We should never have found ourselves in this position where we have no energy security. However, at the same time, we've also got to, as you know, from a Labour movement perspective, focus on people's other priorities as well.
So, Paul, we're now going to hear from the Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner. She's speaking at the Labour conference.
So, welcome, Keir and Angela. And Angela, over to you.
Well, conference, it's a pleasure to speak to you today as your Deputy Leader and to be back in Liverpool together again after our country has endured all those that we lost during the pandemic. And at a time of national mourning, the late Queen stood for unity in the darkest of times and public duty above all else. This is her legacy. For many, this time has been a painful reminder of losing a loved one, as too many of us did during the pandemic. For others, it's a moment to reflect. For me, I think of a lifetime of public service and the legacy we all leave. Now, our duty to the next generation is to shape a future that is brighter than the past. That is our task this week, to set out the future that we should face and that should face our children. Because, conference, I see too much lost potential. Britain deserves better, and I know we can do better. Just look at this government's record since we last gathered in Liverpool just 4 years ago. 3 different leaders, a catalogue of sleaze, waste and lies. Cummins, Patterson and Pincher back to the hill. Chris Grayling, Grant Shapps and too much Matt Hancock. Far too much Matt Hancock. Green cards and non-doms. Tree houses and even tractor porn. Breaking the law in a specific and limited way. Queues at the airports, chaos at the borders, mountains of PPE unfit for use, billions in fraud written off, sewerage in the rivers, a Prime Minister hiding in a fridge, 3 sleaze watchdogs out in the cold, and the Bernard Castle eye test, the Downing Street crime scene, broken swings, wine stains, sick on the walls, 126 fines, more than anywhere else in the country. Rules made, rules broken, Partygate, Wallpapergate, too many gates, too little, too late, mate. And now a Prime Minister who says people don't work hard enough. Well, enough is enough. Just as our country was desperate for change in 1997, we need change now, because Britain is at a crossroads, conference. A moment of decision about what future we all want, about what we can collectively achieve together, and about what we can be. And at this moment, what do the Conservatives offer? Lining the pockets of oil and gas executives, enriching bankers while families are starving. A tax on our most basic rights. Be in no doubt, conference, they're coming after the most basic things that we expect. Decent work, fair pay, the foundations of a family life. Conference, so long as I have breath in my body, I will defend those rights, and including the right to strike. And when in power, we will repeal the anti-worker and anti-trade union laws this Conservative government has enacted. All of it. The Tories are not on the side of working people in Britain today. Liz Truss has already made that clearer than it's ever been. She's chosen to stand for the vested interests, for the oil companies and for the bankers, for those profiting from this crisis and not suffering from it. And it is working families who have been bearing the brunt. When I was a young mum, I remember that sick feeling in my stomach. All it takes is one break, one accident, one mishap, and you can't get by. And if your kids have holes in their shoes, their feet get wet on the way to school. If your fridge breaks, you can't feed your family. It's not a vision for a modern Britain. It is the result of years of Tory decision. Conference, families up and down the country this winter, many for the first time in their lives, are now living on the edge. And it's not just families that are suffering. Years of underinvestment have shattered the resilience of British businesses. I think of the small business owners like Pauline in my constituency of Ashton, who runs a local pub that doubles as a food bank and a community centre. During the pandemic, Pauline had to close her doors. Another small business left out in the cold by this government. And now she's absolutely sick with worry about her energy bills skyrocketing, feeling fear of closure yet again. Local pubs and businesses are the lifeblood of our communities. But at every twist and turn, the government poured money into the pockets of the cronies, leaving people like Pauline high and dry. They need a government on their side. And instead they get Liz Truss. Level down, Liz. Trickle down, Liz. And so I ask Liz Truss today, whose side are you on? When you boost bankers' bonuses but force working people to carry the can for the energy crisis, whose side are you on? Using the pandemic to pile billions into the bank accounts of cronies while nurses wore bin bags, whose side are you on? When you say the working people of this country need more graft, then deprive them of the fair pay. Whose side are you on? Conference, I'll tell you who was on my side when I needed it the most. A Labour government was on my side when I had my first baby and nowhere else to turn. A Labour government was on my side when I didn't have a home, let alone enough money to heat it. And a Labour government was on my side when I wanted to be a good mum to my kids and improve their lives. And I promise you this, Conference, that when I'm Deputy Prime Minister, a Labour government will be on your side too. I will make it my mission to spend every penny of the public money for the good of the nation, making Britain work for working people, investing in our local communities and talent, and standing up for this country. Just as we were in 1997, we're now at a crossroads. The moment of choice is upon us, our movement, to show our country what we can do together. The next Labour government will pump money back into the pockets of local communities, the people who built Britain. Consider this: a third of all government spending goes on procurement, a third. More than the NHS, double the education budget. And Labour will unleash the power of procurement to drive up standards. And today I'm announcing our value for money guarantee. Our pledge to ensure that every single penny of taxpayers' money provides the best possible value to the public. We will turn the Tory procurement racket on its head so it serves the national interest and not the vested interests. Our 5-point national procurement plan will start by rewarding businesses and enterprises who pay their taxes and pay their workers properly, creating opportunities for new jobs and skills and helping our high streets thrive again. To unlock opportunity everywhere and reverse the tide of young people forced to leave their hometowns. Hand in hand with Labour's Green Prosperity Plan for green growth across Britain. And second, we will give small enterprise a level playing field at winning contracts. Where the Tories handed billions of pounds to their cronies with links to tax havens, We will ensure local businesses are no longer shunted to the back of the queue behind giant corporations with more form fillers than they have workers. We will cut red tape and streamline the bidding process, giving small businesses a genuine shot. It will no longer just be the giant corporations with the glossiest leaflets that wins. Everyone will get a fair chance. Those who put into the system and uphold good standards will be rewarded. Now, the Tories had a VIP lane. Their donors, cronies, firms with Tory MPs on their books, or anyone who could WhatsApp Matt Hancock. We will replace that approach entirely. The only fast-track lane I will allow is for local businesses and enterprises who create wealth in our communities and contribute to a fairer society. The VIPs under Labour conference will be all of you, the British public. And thirdly, we will raise standards across the economy by clawing back the public's money from those who fail to deliver for taxpayers. And we'll plough that money back straight into a dynamic, ethical local enterprise fund. Quality and innovation, not failure, will be rewarded. And by striking off failed providers, we will help local businesses thrive. Never again can we see a repeat of the scandal that has seen Tory ministers write off £10 billion on unused PPE they bought with our money, defective, substandard and unfit for use. We'll give the Tory sleaze merchants their marching orders. And instead, conference, we will use the power of procurement to boost local businesses that work for Britain. With Labour, they will no longer be locked out of the system. And fourthly, we will guarantee transparency about taxpayers' money and how it's spent through a public dashboard of government contracts. It's inspired by Ukraine's anti-corruption blueprint. Even under the attack from Russia, they are honest about how they spend public money. So what's the Tories' excuse? They were at it again this week, refusing to come clean to the British public and allow the spending watchdog to assess the true damage of the Tories' discredited trickle-down approach. There'll be no hiding places for cronies and no corner for corruption. We will keep the receipts and we will publish them. At conference, we won't stop there. We will back the workers who are creating Britain's wealth, demanding better for our people. Which brings me on to outsourcing. Conference, the Tories have become too dependent on handing away our public services on the cheap, and now we're all paying the price. We will oversee the biggest wave of insourcing for a generation. Today, I can announce that before any service is contracted out, public bodies must show that the work couldn't be done better in-house. And we'll reinstate and strengthen the two-tier code created by the last Labour government and scrapped by the Tories to end the scandal of outsourced workers getting second-class pay and conditions. But conference will go further still. Building on our new deal for working people, I can today unveil Labour's Fair Work standard. inspired by Labour in power across the country, in Wales, in London, West Yorkshire, the North Tyne, Greater Manchester and here in Liverpool. It will underpin a new fair work code for the public sector, guaranteeing fair conditions, job security, well-being, proper training, rights at work and union access. And we will also create a fair work gold standard to champion the very best of employers. And the Labour government will be on the side of the self-employed too. We will give genuinely self-employed workers the right to a written contract and timely payment by law so they aren't left out of pocket and chasing invoices, because our Fair Work Standard will raise standards for all. And conference, I say this to you now because Labour just doesn't have a vision for this country. We have a plan. And we have a plan to grow a fairer, greener economy. We have a plan to rebuild trust in public office and to clean up politics. We have a plan to unleash the potential the Tories have held back for far too long. And a plan for Britain means we'll rise to the occasion just like we did in 1997. Because the Conservatives, they've made their choice, they've chosen their side, but we are on yours and we are ready to lead this country to better. A Labour government to unite this country through the darkest times ahead. A Labour government to hand power back to the people and the places that once powered Britain. And a Labour government that will always be on the side of working people. The Tories have broken Britain, but together we can rebuild it again and make Britain work for working people once again. Thank you, conference.
That was the speech of the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner, and she very publicly says that she looks forward to being the Deputy Prime Minister in the near future, invoking the spirit of 1997 there, Paul, and making some quite significant announcements, her 5-point national procurement plan, and then talking about a fair workers' standard. There was quite a lot in the speech, wasn't there?
Yeah, I thought there was quite a bit of red meat for the troops in the hall. The stuff about workers' rights will go down well, inevitably, as you would expect at a Labour Party conference. I thought it was OK. I mean, it's a tradition in the Labour Party that the Deputy Leader always gives a bit of a tub-thumping speech, whereas the Leader's speech is a little bit more sober and a little more serious. So in the days, for example, when Blair was Leader and Prescott was the Deputy, he would always give a very, very full-throated tub-thumping speech at the rostrum. And I think from Angela Rayner's point of view, she is, agree with her or not, she is an authentic voice. I mean, she comes from a humble background, she comes from a working class community, she hasn't been on that conveyor belt, you know, like lots of other Labour MPs had, where they went through university, worked for a think tank or whatever. She comes from an ordinary working class background, and I think inevitably that will endear her to lots of people in the hall, and probably outside as well.
Yeah. Emma, what did you make of the speech?
Goodness gracious, there's a lot to unpack in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, one of the things that really stood out to me was the contradictions between some of those promises there.
Yeah.
So promising value for money, but then also promising to insource much more, which would I was going to say presumably, it would mean getting less value for money because there'd be less competition in terms of the prices they'd be paying for things. So that doesn't seem to really stack up with the idea that this is a plan rather than a vision. I also picked up on the fact that she didn't mention, she talked about Britain, so she essentially cut Northern Ireland.
Yes, as you can imagine, I noticed that quite a lot too. Britain was mentioned a lot, not the United Kingdom, but we'll come back to that again, I'm sure. Thanks.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
to each and every one of you
for helping our great nation
find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England,
Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
On TV,
on radio,
and online. We're proud to be the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flock at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hi there.